Grace and peace to you this morning from God, our loving Father, merciful Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Love God, and everything else falls into its proper place. Everything falls into its proper place when you love God. When you love God, people in Jackson, Mississippi will have water. When you love God, there will be no hungry children around. When you love God, there will be no people shooting each other during the day. When you love God, you will be anxious to make sure that God's people are cared for, even with the small things that we can do. In our 54 years of marriage, our family had moved around and lived in 6 different towns. We lived in 8 different houses during that 54 years. We also knew that as we moved around, that these towns and these houses were not really our home. Sure, we bought them, we did those things, but our home was not there. Our home was with God. Whether we actually said that every day or not, our home was in God. I had an aunt who used to tell me, half serious and half kidding, she'd say, "You're a rolling stone, and a rolling stone gathers no moss." And we'd all look at our hands and our arms and say, "Well, we don't particularly want moss on us, so maybe we should keep moving." In the 15th chapter of Luke, and we moved from there from last week, there are 3 parables. And we can't understand today's lesson without some background, without building up to that. Jesus, as he started to move or walk up to Jerusalem on his final journey, he was in fact teaching his disciples, arming his disciples. In that 15th chapter of Luke, we heard the parable of a lost sheep, a lost coin, and even a lost son. Each of these objects were very valuable, and when the owners found them, or when the father found the son, or the son returned, there was much rejoicing. In Luke chapter 16, there are 2 parables. One may get away from you if we're not careful. But we know that Jesus' teachings were cumulative. His disciples had heard other lessons on how to get along, how to be safe, how to preach the good news to people, how to advance the kingdom. But Jesus felt the need to do further teaching for them as he prepared to leave the earth. In Matthew 10, we hear his statement, "Behold, I send you as sheep in the middle of wolves. Be you therefore wise as serpents and as harmless as doves." No 2 creatures are more opposite to one another in nature. The serpent looks at the dove and eyes a meal. The dove looks back at the serpent, not entirely sure of what is going on. But when it does dawn on him, the dove is terrorized. When we think about today's gospel lesson, we have to think about geography and what all of that means. Now, many of you are probably fans of the National Geographic magazine. It has lots of pictures in it about people, how they live, what they grow, what their cultures are like. It's a fascinating magazine. I've had difficulty in getting rid of them, so I dragged them around from New York about 35 years ago, all the way up to the present with us now. There's just stacks of them in the garage and in the house. I find it difficult to get rid of those pictures. But 1st century Palestine, the geography becomes very, very important. And there's another statement that I'd like for you to consider. That all of the gospel, or virtually all of it, is based on reactions to the occupation of the Romans in Palestine and in Israel. At that time, the wealthy people in Israel or in Palestine lived in the southern part of the kingdom. They lived in and around Jerusalem. In the northern part, in Galilee, lived the farmers. And to illustrate the things to make it more dramatic, we'll say they were dirt farmers, which means, for the most part, they were poor. But the poor people in the northern part would bear the brunt of the taxes that the Roman Empire would collect from them. While those in the southern part, in and around Jerusalem, the administrators, the Roman government officials, the army, even the people in the temple, they were, for the most part, better off. And because they were better off, they didn't pay the taxes that the people in the northern part paid. Sounds familiar? When we were in New York, when we first moved, they told us, this was the relocation advisor, move north. When we moved to the Chicago area, they said, move north. When we lived on Long Island, they said, move north. We simply couldn't afford to move north. We had to live on the South Shore. But this, I give you this illustration just to say that the geography would often define people and might even confine people in such a way that it determined not only lifestyle, but their futures. It was good for the people in the South because they could sell the goods that came from the farms in the North to the Romans and to each other. There was wine that the Romans needed, that was needed in the temple. There was bread that was needed. The Romans needed lots of wheat, lots of bread. And there was olive oil that was needed, not only in Israel or first century Palestine, but in Rome itself, because people there often cleansed themselves with the olive oil. But as it has been pointed out, the Gospel of Luke calls for support and care of God's people. Not just the wealthy, the well-off, the well-educated, but the poor. But the Gospel does not give permission or approval for business practices that are dishonest. You might assume that in this parable that you heard, that there was some dishonesty. You might also assume that maybe the dishonesty was deception designed to help people survive during the time. So Jesus told the story to his disciples to illustrate a very, very important point. And this is the story that you've heard, and we'll summarize it. There was a rich man who would collect his percentages from the poor farmers, from land that they did not till, they did not work, and they did not harvest. Because of this, the manager saw a scheme and saw an opportunity. The wealthy, probably in the South, had agreed to pay the taxes for the poor farmer in exchange from the produce from their farms. Now let's visit that for a while. Farmers have difficulty in paying the taxes that are imposed upon them by the Romans. Many of them would probably lose their farm. And so rich people would come and say, have I got a deal for you? I will pay your taxes. Woohoo! Pay the taxes. But I want you to sign here on the bottom line. Sign the deeds over to me. And you can still live on the farms. All you have to do is continue to work the farms and give me a certain percentage of the produce. Sounds like a good deal? Well, if your back's up against the wall, it probably was a good deal. So this is what is going on in the northern kingdom and in the southern kingdom. The rich man or the rich men would regularly send their managers up to the north to collect their percentages of the produce. And each year, the rich would sort of close in and tighten up the requirements, increase their demands just a little bit. Imagine then that the rich man heard that his manager, in fact, was cheating him. That he was not getting everything that he needed from the farmers. Imagine what would happen. This is implied but not written in the gospel. And so he called in the manager and told the manager, I've heard that you have grand living styles. Bring your books in, prepare them for an audit, and by the way, you're fired. So what does the manager do? Well, what would you do? We all know the commandment that we are to love the Lord thy God with all thy soul, heart, and mind. And in a crisis, how does that apply? I'll bet many of you in a crisis situation can outthink almost anybody to get out of that situation. Sometimes I've done my best thinking in a crisis situation. So, before the office is vacated and the desk cleaned out, the manager then calls in the people who owed the rich man. Whether it was olive oil, bushels or gallons of them, or whether or not it was wheat, he cut the debt in half for the olive oil by 20 to 30% for the wheat. Told them to make new invoices up and present them. Sounds strange, doesn't it? But think about it. How many of you have enjoyed those sales in the large department stores? And how many of you ever wondered, how could the merchant afford to cut the price of something by 50 to 80%? Well, it's very simple. You were being overcharged anyway. How could that happen? I worked on a product once where we had about 5 cents worth of medicine in a vial. To use the water and the packaging and all of that, it raised the price to about $10 for a vial. But the company could sell that for $40 or $50 per vial. So that's how that was affordable. The owner was not losing anything, but the idea of being cheated probably rubbed him the wrong way. But he didn't have the manager arrested. What he said was, great, that's good thinking. He commended the thinking. The disciples, and probably us this morning, would like to know, why is Jesus commending dishonesty? He really isn't. It was the idea of the manager thinking through a situation using the brain. We go back to that commandment, God expects us to use our brain. You get the impression that God may not like stupid people, especially when you have the opportunity to use your brain. And so we see that, this thinking, the idea of rapidly using everything you have to take care of oneself. So Jesus wants to know, why can't they do that, the disciples, and why can't we do that in advancing the kingdom, in preaching the gospel? How is it that the crooks have all of this enthusiasm, do all of this planning, but we as Christians, as church people, may not do that? I don't know if you remember the series The Sopranos on TV many, many years ago, or even The Godfather. I don't know if you were impressed with all of the planning that went into the theft and the murders that occurred in those pictures. So Jesus is asking the question of us and of his disciples, why is it that you cannot do that to advance the kingdom? I remember from the playground in grade school, one of the phrases that we learned very quickly, and that was, with all of the name calling and all of the things that went on occasionally, we learned the phrase, it takes one to know one. And in this case, perhaps the manager and the owner were of the same mind, because it took one to know one. So what does this mean for us then? The manager had already said that he was too weak and too old to dig ditches, and he was too proud to beg. That's what was going on there, a meeting of the mind. As I've said, part of the blessings that God gives us is our brain, the ability to think, the ability to get out of situations, but also the ability to use this for the advancement of the kingdom. Now, this difference between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, between the rich and the poor, the rich giving the poor the opportunity to keep their property, their farms, their lives, that has traveled down through the centuries. Even here in the U.S., even here in this area, there was a system that developed called sharecropping, and the same principles applied. And today, there are still people who are suffering from that. Even here today, money that is allocated for the poor, even for hospitals, especially in the southern part of Georgia, for rural roads, all of that money, or much of that money, never reached or never reaches the poor. Some of you may remember the crisis that we had in the 1960s. It was called the highways and rural roads. Monies that the government had allocated, taxes for those rural roads, never solved those communities, but it solved the pockets of many people. And so you see that this principle, the geography, all of that, even in first century Palestine, affects us today. So again, Jesus is not commending theft. He's not commending dishonesty, but he's simply saying, take the energy that you would use, or that the dishonest people use. Take some of that. And we go back to the section from Matthew 10, or from the passage from Matthew 10. Be as cunning as serpents, but as harmless as doves. One morning I was in a class, a certificate program at Northwestern, the Kellogg School. This class is on leadership and reinventing models for leadership. And it lasted a couple months. And two people who taught the class, one was the managing director of the World Bank. We went into class, there were about 30 of us, very expensive class, expecting a lesson, and the two professors walked in and they sat there. One on the stool and one on the front row. They didn't say anything. There were no assignments given, no work groups, Nothing. They just sat there. And many of us, as we thought about what we were paying for this course, began to get angry. And by lunchtime, we had decided that we would go to the dean of the catalog school. And by the evening, we had had that conference. And this is what the dean told us. Congratulations, you passed. Well, what did that mean? He said, you passed because you refused to sit somewhere and not get what you were supposed to get. You refused to be mistreated. And I commend you for that. Actually, the two professors who were sitting there not saying anything to you were doing that on purpose to make sure that you understood that as a leader, you always will have to say something when things were not going right, not going according to the regulation, not going according to what you paid for. So you passed, congratulations, now let's go to the bar. So that's how that turned out. We've all been in situations where sitting in classrooms or sitting in a lecture, sometimes I've seen it sitting in a congregation doing a sermon, where people are doodling. Kids will even go beyond that, and not only doodle, they'll actually draw pictures and paint. And that is common for the mind that is not completely occupied or used. A teacher told me once, if you put half the work and the attention into your studies, as opposed to what you put into your artwork, then you'd be a very, very important person. And we both laughed with that. But that is to say, if we then can put into advancing the kingdom, sharing the gospel, taking care of God's people, then the world would be a better place. And if your priority is to bring good news to the poor, to your neighbor, then perhaps you should redirect your energy. Love God and the thing that God loves, everything else will always fall in place. Let us ask ourselves a question this morning. Can I be as energetic, as alert, as smart, as devoted to serving God's need on earth as I do in serving my own need? Amen.